I'm your host, Sarah St. John, and my guest today is the CEO of Communication Queens and the founder of crownyourself.com. Welcome to the show, my friend and fellow entrepreneur, Kimberly Spencer.
Hey, Sarah.
So I gave a little bit of an intro on you, but I'd love for you to share, because I know you have quite an interesting story, and I'd love it if you could share that with the audience.
Yeah, so I've been an entrepreneur since I was 19 years old. I was raised by two entrepreneur parents. So it's very much in my blood, kind of in my DNA, to do something that's different. And my first business was a brick and mortar Pilates studio in LA. And from that, it evolved into, and I did that to support myself in my career with screenwriting. Once I fulfilled a dream at 24 and had the first film that I co-wrote, distributed, picked up by Lionsgate. Danny Trejo was in it. Once that happened, I was like, okay, 24, dream fulfilled. What next? Like, is that all there is? And something that you learn as a screenwriter is like, you're kind of like the architect and the blueprint. And I looked at all the other roles of producer, director, the actors, and I was like, I kind of want to do all of them. I always wanted to do all of them anyways. And I said, well, how do I do that in the form of Pilates? And Pilates was never my main goal to be my main business, but it did turn into a great, thriving business in LA. And from that role, I got offered the opportunity to become a consultant on an e-commerce startup project and on a new back stretching device. And so I saw the product and I saw, because of my Pilates background, I was like, I know how to tell the story of this product as a screenwriter. And I also know how to sell this product and who to sell it to. I don't just want to be a consultant, I want to be a partner. So I hopped on that company and became president for 2 years, took that product, got it featured in all the major magazines, on New York Times Billboard, got to pitch it to the first round of Shark Tank auditions. And right when we were going for like venture capital and angel investors, my business partner and I had this underlying tension of a difference of values as to how we wanted to run the company. Because I'm raised by entrepreneurs, I'm very startup, very scrappy, and he was from a different model. And so he decided to buy me out, and I didn't want to do that. So I fought him for 3 months, and we finally signed the buyout agreement 3 weeks before I got married. Jumped on a plane, went to Italy after I got married, and was like, what do I do when I get home? Because I had spent 2 years of my life building this company and I'd had so many different interests. And my husband and I were brainstorming like you do on your honeymoon.
For those just listening, she did a little wink.
And we were just talking about all my varied interests. I'd been a pageant girl. I'd overcome bulimia. I'd overcome relationship issues and met the love of my life. And I was able to grow a business and like grow multiple businesses and have my first film produced and writing. Like I had all these different passions. And I leaped off the couch and I said, crown yourself. And my husband's like, what's that? And I said, I don't know. I think it's something like Marie Forleo. And so I immediately went to work, got to doing all the productive procrastination stuff that I tell my clients now not to do, which is buying all the tech, all the fancy film equipment. But I didn't. For a year and a half in my business, I made $100. And yeah. And it was because of my subconscious beliefs, because that buyout experience and dealing with lawyers for the first time in ever, and having them bring every fear and limiting belief about my education, my age, my being female, everything to the forefront. And I know now it was to get my price down, but that experience put so much self-doubt into my world. And I allowed for that to fester. And so for a year and a half, I was doing the photo shoots and I had the nice website and I had all the things. But what I didn't have was income coming in for my business. And then I found out that I was pregnant with my first son. And that just changed everything, because I knew it was a mindset block. I knew I could overcome that mindset block. And fast forward to that, we grew it to a multi-six-figure annual business in a few years. And when 2020 hit, we were in Australia and we got stuck there. We were those Americans who got stuck abroad. And my husband was like, okay, my industry's shutting down. You're now the breadwinner. And I was like, oh, everything's on me. And that's what launched us into this next iteration and evolution of, we still have Crown Yourself. We still have our coaching company. We trimmed it back to just doing one-on-one high level coaching. And we launched our podcast guesting agency, because while I was in Australia, it was podcast guesting that generated new business revenue for our company, because I couldn't do live events, because not only because of COVID, because of my visa. That was used to be the way that I would drive new client generation. And so I started podcasting, and that changed everything. And we did $250,000 in sales from just podcast interviews. And that's a new business revenue, which is much harder to generate than recurring business revenue from existing customers. And so I stumbled onto this process and I was like, I think I'm onto something. And we launched a course initially called Communication Queens. My audience and community loved it. And then we launched it again. And then got kind of tired of hearing about podcasting. We asked our audience, because we poll them after every launch, and they said, well, we don't really want a course that teaches us how to do it. We just kind of want it done for us. And I was like, okay. And so I turned to my team and gauged the interest, and they're like, yeah, we could totally do it. We've done it for you. We've gotten you booked on major podcast interviews. It's generated revenue. Of course we can do it for somebody else. So we beta tested it in October of 2020. And then we moved to Texas and then launched officially the agency in January of 2023. And it has grown bananas because I am so excited for the clients that we are able to serve at such a high level and getting them booked on some of the great top podcasts and seeing our clients have similar results, booking speaking gigs, getting coaching clients, getting affiliate partnerships, generating referral business. Some even generate business even before the podcast is distributed. And why they do that is because of relationship. And because we don't teach on going on somebody else's podcast to like, I'm going to try to convert you to become a client, because that's gross. And that's not why you're being invited onto somebody else's podcast in the first place. But going onto somebody else's podcast can be so powerful for generating social proof and for generating and building a relationship with someone who has an influence with an audience like you.
Aw, I didn't know about that first half of that story. So what movie was that?
It was a very indie niche movie called Bro. And it was about the high flying, hard partying world of freestyle motocross.
Hmm.
And originally when I was pitched it, it was never about motocross, because I was asked like, how did you write a movie about motocross? And I said, it's called YouTube. And I researched. And secondly, it's a story about belonging. And we've all, like, in screenwriting, you learn that there are only 7 stories that are 7 human stories that we relate to. And one of them is always about belonging and trying to fit in with the cool crowd. And every single person has that story where we've tried to fit in, we didn't feel like we fit in. And what does it mean to belong? And how do we find our tribe, the people who just get us, the people who make us giggle and take 8 minutes to start a podcast interview because we just are having so much fun? Like, how do we find those people? And so that's really what the movie was about. And it just so happened to involve freestyle motocross. And what's really cool is that in the motocross community, it taught me very much about niche marketing, because it was a very niche indie film.
I'm curious, since you mentioned there's 7, what's the other 6?
The other 6, off the top of my head, it's in my book, Make Every Podcast Want You. There's the Odyssey, the story of the journey.
Okay.
There is the rags to riches, the villain to victor. There's comedy, there's tragedy. So comedy, tragedy. So those are 4. And then the other 2, I'm at a loss for at this moment. They're in my book, Make Every Podcast Want You, which is coming out this fall.
Yeah, a subtle pitch there. I was like, yeah, I think I remember you talking about a book coming out. And I'm like, it didn't already come out and I missed it, right?
No, there are 2 books coming out this year, and I'm very excited.
Oh, yeah, I know about the other one.
It's the entrepreneur spirit. Like, I can't not create, and it's a very visionary thing. So the second book that Sarah is alluding to is a children's fart book that I was inspired by. And I think that's one of the cool things about podcasting in general. And it's one of the tenets of what I've found is really what gets you booked onto bigger podcasts is having a more interesting story. So write a motocross movie, write a fart book. I just learned how to ride a motorcycle a decade after writing a film about motocross. But yeah,
Wow.
So do interesting things with your life. And it's a huge piece in my coaching is I encourage my clients to have a hobby, because your business ain't your hobby.
Right, exactly. So in terms of podcast guesting and bringing in all this revenue, and now you are helping other people get booked on other podcasts. I know we were talking a little bit before this about how as frugalpreneurs, it's one of the best ways to really get out there, because it's usually 99.9% of the time free to do. I would love it if you touched more on that.
Yes, I'm going to get so nerdy for just a hot second.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We had to do it at least just once.
We had to do it one time, just one time. And Okay, so super nerdy. 66% of podcast listeners have a college degree or higher. 66% of podcast listeners are making over 100K or higher. None of these social media platforms even compare to those numbers. You have to combine Facebook and Instagram to get that high of somebody who is an educated and affluent buyer, which means they're going to be more educated and affluent when you're presenting your services in general. They also, 42% of millennials report purchasing from recommendations from the podcast host. Recommendations can also include the guests you have on, and the podcasts are saying, go buy her stuff, go work with her. And I've had that happen on podcasts just because when you deliver heaping amounts of value and you demonstrate your skill set and your knowledge and your mastery of the subject that you are speaking on, people automatically are like, oh, she knows what she's talking about, or he knows what he's talking about. I want to explore more. At least they get into your world. They get on your email list, or they listen to your podcast, or they follow you on social medias, and they're on the periphery learning about you, but you've been introduced to them by being on somebody else's podcast. Plus, if you're like me and have a service-based business, and a lot of service-based businesses start out with what? A discovery call, a strategy session. So when you start doing that and it's a cold strategy session, and I know because I've done a lot of them over 9 years of coaching, a cold strategy session typically has an incredibly low conversion rate because you're just getting to know each other. Versus if somebody hops onto a strategy call after a podcast interview, they've already spent 20 minutes of their time learning about you. And if you can, on the podcast interview, also address some of the common objections that come up around working with you. Like, for example, for us, a common objection with working with a podcast guesting agency is, oh, I'll just wait until next quarter. And so one of the things that I'll say is, hey, most podcasts have only about 52 episodes, right? One a week for the whole year, 52 slots. We're already booking our clients out for Q4 of 2024 and already into 2025. And that's now. So podcast guesting is a longer term game. So I'll share, so like I just very meta did that, I shared that piece of knowledge, but I also overcame a common objection that we normally get on a sales call. So in that way, that already primes your potential buyer who is more interested and they're more aware of these common things, and they've already overcome an objection. So you don't have to work as hard on the sales call. The same is true with the other piece about podcast guesting is you get to build a relationship. And typically a podcast host is the best reflection of who their audience is. And so if you can build a relationship with a podcast, like one of my friends, actually two of my friends, Alan and Kevin of the Next Level University podcast, they came in to teach a class to our communication queens. And they taught about how to get booked on a top 100 podcast. And they mentioned about this gentleman, Mike Kim, who came onto their podcast, Next Level University. And we're talking about his book, You Are the Brand. They've now talked about him on their podcast on a second episode that he wasn't on in my class. So already Mike Kim, this guy who wrote this book, is now in my audience's earbuds of like, oh, I should get that book. And then I mentioned him in my book because I mentioned this as a great example. And now I'm mentioning him here again. So he's got now 5 points of exposure because of going on one podcast interview. That is killer brand awareness, far more investment worthy than a Facebook ad. And the reach for podcast guesting, you cannot get the retention of a podcast episode is typically 20 minutes. So a Facebook ad, an Instagram post, 1.7 seconds. So the retention, the depth of learning, the depth of understanding, the depth of connection, nothing in marketing compares to a podcast interview.
Those are great points. I love that. I have my own podcast, obviously. That's what we're doing right now. Hobby. But I guest on others. I'll be a guest on yours coming up this week.
You will.
And I think a lot of people, maybe they don't want to start their own podcast, but podcast guesting is a great, well, I think even as a podcast host, you should guest. But if you're not a podcast host, I think guesting is a great way to, like, okay, here's an example. Liz Wilcox, you know her.
Yeah, Liz.
The email marketing guru, whatever.
She's amazing and survivalist, right?
Yeah, she's on Survivor right now. As of the time of this recording, she is still in it in the top, 6 or something.
Good for her.
But it's funny because like I had her on my podcast, I don't know, probably a year or something ago. And then I was at Podfest. You and I were both there at Podfest in January. Well, of course, you know Liz Wilcox.
Yeah,
We
we
went
all
to
went to
dinner
dinner
together.
together.
Why? Oh, man. Wow. Okay. Anyway, so we were at Podfest, and like I didn't know she was going to be there. Apparently, she lives, or at least she's about to move. Apparently, but anyway, lived in Orlando. That's where Podfest was. But I saw her in the hall. I mean, she's hard to miss because she's colorful and crazy
She's
clothes
got
and
her
everything.
brand nailed down for sure.
Yeah, and I was like, "Liz?" And anyway, and I just thought it was so interesting that she was at a podcast conference because she doesn't have a podcast. She just guests out the wazoo, and her main business is a $9 a month. It's very low ticket, $9 a month membership platform. And yet, because she guests so much on podcasts, she makes, well, I assume it's okay if I say this because she told me, I don't know, but like $500,000
Yeah.
because there's just the sheer number of people that are in, that would be like what, 5,000 people or something that are in her program. So I think that that's a good example of someone who doesn't even have a podcast. They go on other podcasts a lot and have made so much money just by doing that.
Yeah. And it's free for the most part. Like you said, like there are some top podcasts that want a collaboration of advertising and sponsorship. But for the most part, you go on a podcast and the main investment is in either your time, which for me, that is the biggest investment, more than money. And so that's why I pay a team to do that for me. And then people pay our team to do that for them. Because what I found is once you get to the 7-8 figure level, people really value time more than money and how you can save their time. But with podcast guesting, when we were just starting out, I had 2 VAs and I had them going on all the places. And we started submitting to 100 podcasts a week. That was a lot. We did that for 2 months. I got like 20 interviews and like pop the cherry real fast. Like, let's just...
I feel like this episode's going to be rated at least PG-13.
Like, get out there, get used to sharing my story, I was used to sharing my story, but not in mass, not on a regular basis. And it was when I found out, and this is hearsay, Brendan Burchard has been my mentor since 2018. And he has coached me, and I have just loved being a certified high performance coach. And it was at one of his seminars that he was talking about his book, The Motivation Manifesto, and Tony Robbins' book, Money, Master the Game, which I think they both came out in like 2008. And he said, Tony did 600 podcast interviews in that year. And his book stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for 16 weeks longer than Brendan's did. And that alone, because podcast listeners are learners, 3 out of 4 tune in to learn something new. So you're speaking to an audience that values education. So if you have a book, if you have something that they can learn, that they can subscribe to, like a $9 membership, that's like a no-brainer, especially if you're learning tools that can help increase your value as an entrepreneur. Podcast guesting, it's free and it's done. The hard parts are done by other people. Now, there is an energy to podcast guesting that needs to be addressed, is that it's the energy of a relationship. And in a relationship, no one likes a taker. So if you go on someone's podcast and then ghost them like a one night stand and you just like, bye, thanks for the interview and the visibility. And then
wham, bam, thank you, ma'am.
Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. And then you never post the podcast. You never share it with your network. You don't advertise it. You don't thank them. You don't give them like a LinkedIn recommendation or write them a review. We have a whole list of 15 things that we recommend our clients do after a podcast interview to really foster and build in gratitude and generosity into the relationship, because that's what's essential. Is this podcaster is doing a ton of work. They are putting you in front of their audience. The biggest thing is respect their audience big time. Because most podcasters, especially the top podcasters, everyone that I've talked to, they deeply value their audience and they will trash an episode if they feel like that person does not value the audience as much.
Yeah, I love that point that when you're a guest on another show, you just have to show up and offer value, but you don't have to create the assets and do the editing and all this stuff. And they've already built their audience, whether it's 100 people or 100,000, they've built up their audience. Yeah, it's basically like free publicity. So when your episode goes live, you definitely should share it as well, in my opinion. And sometimes the podcast host will even provide swipe copy or images or videograms or whatever that you can share. But yeah, it is frustrating as a host if you provide stuff and then the guest doesn't share it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one thing about everyone's so focused on getting big name guests on your show. And I think getting big name guests on your show, as long as it's within your niche, it's good for, I guess, maybe authority or credibility.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're expecting them to share the episode and you getting a whole bunch of downloads from that, that's usually not the case. You actually usually do better in that sense with smaller guests. But
Same is true actually with guesting. Is like a lot, there's a perception with guesting. I have converted more clients and more business from smaller podcasts that are maybe in the 100 to 250 downloads per episode versus the ones that have gotten like 2,000.
oh, I see what you're saying. Oh, so like when you're a guest on another show,
Mm-hmm.
don't just go for the shows that have
Yeah.
tens of thousands of downloads a month. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's part of our framework because even though you can go for the shows that have tens of thousands, and yes, there is revenue in that, and there's revenue from the visibility. The ones that I've just seen consistently convert more are the smaller podcasts. And so
Mm,
I think don't downplay them if your message, because it comes down to the niching. Like if or niching, I say niching.
I'd say
Um,
niche, yeah.
right? The reaches are in the niches.
Or the Reese's, like
Right?
the
That's what I
candy.
think. The Reese's are in the niches. I prefer that. So, yum.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. So, so that is part of the niching aspect though. Is like if you can communicate to an audience that even though they are smaller, and let's say if I'm speaking to an audience about visibility and it's a smaller audience and it's a smaller podcast, then one of the challenges and struggles and pain points that I might address is they might feel like they're not big enough to be big. That's a pain point that I can definitely target and speak directly to because of the size of the audience. Big, broad podcasts, also, what I've seen, the big mistake that people make is that they go on these big podcasts. They think that it builds their authority. Like, I mean, you go on Tom Bilyeu's Impact Theory, you have impact. And their ideal customer might not be listening to that because it
Mhm.
depends on who your ideal customer is. For one of our clients is parents. A lot of entrepreneurs I know listen to Tom Bilyeu's Impact Theory. I know I do. I love Tom Bilyeu. He's just amazing. I don't think a lot of parents who are just looking at who are one of our clients' audiences is moms who are a little crunchy, who like to do things their own way, who maybe homeschool. They are more listening to things that they're in alignment with, not necessarily the ones that maybe Tom Bilyeu is. And that's fine. That's okay. Go on the giant ones, get your authority, but also look at what are the podcasts that your avatar is listening to, because that's where the gold is. Looking at where our client's ideal customer is. And then what podcasts are they listening to? And a lot of times it's not the giant big ones.
That's a good point because for a while there, I was just basically guesting on any kind of entrepreneurial or business show and didn't even really look in to see really anything. But that gets exhausting.
Me too. That's how
Yeah. And
100
then
podcasts a week. Whew.
I recently launched a podcast marketing agency, and there's a podcast called Podcast Marketing Secrets. And I was just a guest on that this past week. Well, recorded, it's not out yet. And so I think now I'm trying to focus on going on podcasts about podcasting or podcast marketing. What should well, I mean, first of all, someone could hire your company to help with this. But if someone is kind of DIYing it and trying to figure out what podcasts to go on, what should they be looking for? Should they be looking at, okay, first of all, when was the last time this person released an episode? How many episodes? Can I figure out how many downloads, what their listen score is on listen notes, and like all these different things?
You can, absolutely. And I love that you brought that up because we do have a DIY option as well. So like we
Mm,
do have done for you and done by you. And
okay.
that we teach the same framework, the same structure, the same systems, and it applies to both. So if you're looking at, for example, who are your ideal customers? We had a divorce client come through and she was going on all of these divorce podcasts. And she's like, but I haven't converted a dime from podcasts. And I said, yeah, because people who are listening to divorce podcasts already have a lawyer. And she was like, oh. And I said, you need to look at when people are hiring you. And she goes, oh, well, that's when they're in the beginning proceeds. And I said, you need to go on relationship podcasts. You need to go, and your topics then are the 10 signs that you're leading to divorce, or what are how to uncouple consciously with kids, how to not drag your ex-partner's name through the mud when you're dealing with divorces with children. She crushed it. And that's the power that comes from choosing and knowing when your client comes to you in the life cycle of their business. So one of the things is, yes, we can look at the basics of metrics. So first, 90% of podcasts are not worth your time, period. Oh, there's a ton of Facebook groups, and we have one as well. The Find a Guest, Be a Guest, and those are great. But a lot of times those podcasters are newer, and most podcasters, 90% of them, don't make it past 10 episodes. So you want to look at having somebody who has a track record of credibility, meaning they have 30 to 50 episodes produced. Typically, we've found that if they have, based on the number of reviews that they have, add a 0 in the ones place, and that's about how many downloads per episode they're going to have. Guesstimate, but that's by asking your audience for reviews. As a podcaster, you are engaging in social proof, and there's an awareness that speaks to us that says, oh, they have some awareness of social proof in marketing. So that's generally a roundabout way of saying, like, we aim for about 5 reviews. So anything above that is whipped cream cherries on top, but aim for about 5 reviews. And then they have to have produced an episode within 90 days. Very simple. The only times that we challenge that is when it's a seasonal podcast, because sometimes seasonal podcasts will take a year off, but we then make sure that for the seasonal podcast that it is the 3rd season, not the 2nd season. Because sometimes podcasters will say it's a seasonal podcast and they just really have pod fade, and that 2nd season is kind of lingering in the ether of not really being decided as to when. And so we don't want to book our clients on those interviews and then have them lingering and waiting, because we also produce some marketing assets for our clients so that they can promote the podcast that they've been on and leverage that social media as proof. So that extends the lifespan of their contract if we're waiting another 6 months for the podcaster to just get their stuff together.
I've been a guest on, there's probably been at least a handful of podcasts where I was a guest where we had a really good conversation. It was a really long conversation, almost too long. And then the podcast never gets released. And it's like, okay, well, that was a waste of time.
Yeah. I mean, and sometimes that's why we say, look at these basic qualifications at the bare minimum. You can always go on Listen Notes, look on Chartable, see when their last episode was produced, see what their ranking score is. Cause then there you have the top 5%, and then you have the top 5% of the 5%. And we aim for the top 5% of the 5%. But sometimes, like I said, we know that the conversions into clients and customers and speaking gigs can come from those smaller podcasts. So that's the bare minimum standard that we aim for, is that we call it the 5-30-90 rule. A podcast interview, I have known several people, none of my clients, thank God, to be used as a pick your brain session.
Oh.
Where it's disguised as a podcasting interview, but it's really like, I'm new in my business. I'm looking to talk with the more established entrepreneurs, get free coaching, get free advice. We want to be on the lookout for those. And that's why you want to make sure that they've distributed. It's a huge key aspect.
Yeah, I haven't even heard of that before. Okay, so at least 5 reviews, at least 30 episodes, and at least an episode in the past 90 days, unless it's seasonal, in which case make sure they've had 2 seasons out.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about what someone should look for in determining which podcasts to try to get on. And assuming that these podcasts are in your niche and everything as well. What would be the best? Well, there's 2 more things I want to discuss. Podcast pitching, to pitch to be a guest on someone's show. And then also any kind of tips for once you are on the show and how to make that the most beneficial for everybody involved, but to where you will hopefully get clients or customers out of it.
Yeah. So first thing, pitching. Let's address that. Okay. I have had my own podcast, which is a top 2% podcast, Crown Yourself, with my coaching company for 5 years now. 5 years. And I have received a ton, as I'm sure you have too, of bad pitches from somebody in a foreign country where neither the name nor the name of the podcast nor any specificities about who you are is mentioned, which to me says that they don't care about my audience. And like I said earlier, podcasters who have been at the game for a while, they're in the top 5% of the 5%, they value their audience because they know that their audience has shown up on repeat for weeks, sometimes years. And that is a relationship to be respected. So if someone doesn't even say my name or say the name of the podcast, it immediately goes in the trash. My whole team knows that. It just, bye, Felicia. So say the name of the podcast.
Say my name. Y'all should see us when we get in a room together at like a conference or whatever. It's wild.
Ridiculous. And so much fun. And it goes to prove the point that it's about building a real relationship, not just having things be based on like, what can you do for me and my clients? What can you do for my business? That's ridiculous. Like I was just on this amazing executive mastermind call, and we had to introduce ourselves without saying what we did or anything about our business. Right? It changes how you relate to people, because no longer are you thinking in any frame or context, what can you do for me? Except for maybe like, I'm always like, any books recommendations? I will always take a book recommendation.
True.
100%. So pitching, say the name, say the podcast, that's basic rules. Then say what drew you to the podcast, and take a look at some of the episodes. Go through and see how can I pitch myself in a way that differentiates myself, but also shows similarities. So one of our clients, Megan Camille, we pitched her for a podcast that had previously had I think a porn producer on and talking about the business of porn. And so our client had a horrific sex trafficking story that she shared, where she was sex trafficked when she was 19 years old. But she then went on to build 4 successful 6-figure and 7-figure businesses using her intuition. So it was great. So we could say, okay, you had this person on to show this side of the story of the business. Now we have somebody who made her first million in that industry, and she didn't get to keep the first million, but she made her first million in that industry. And so let's leverage that story since you had that other person on. And here's how we could add to that if you already found that episode to be of value to your audience. So it adds another layer of depth to that, rather than like, it's kind of like the text or I don't know, I haven't dated in 12 years, but gosh, I remember when I was in LA, it was like, well, I have a BMW. And I was like, I don't care. But it was like, I have a BMW and a great job. And like, here's look at all the great things that I can do. And like, you're going to be so satisfied by having me on your show. And it's like, sure, maybe some people will respond to that. But when you're going for those higher level podcasts and those top 5% of the 5%, you want to have something where it shows that you actually care about the other person. Say, hey, I took a listen to this episode. I really enjoyed it. Even if you just don't even listen, but you skim through and say, hey, I saw, and look at the description. Even that, at bare minimum, that will allow you to have some relatability to the context of what they already are talking about. When I have someone say they want to share their golden nuggets about real estate and loan investments on Crown Yourself podcast, I'm like, that is not what we talk about at all on Crown Yourself, period. You could be the greatest real estate investor of all time, but I wouldn't know that from your bio. The other thing is that I would say from your bio has to include your story. It has to have some level of your story in it, something that makes you interesting, weird, different, quirky, and also demonstrate a level of mastery. So my bio, one of the interesting things with my bio is that it says from the age of 5 selling bags of glitter water to business that I've had. But that's a point of interest. I've had, I would say on about 30, maybe 40% of the podcasts that I go on, they're like, tell me about the glitter water. And I said,
now I want to know.
Okay. It's a really fancy thing. It's plastic bags where you pour water in it, and then you sprinkle some glitters. And then what I did was I split tested the price points for 5 cents or $50 to see who would pay what. No one paid 50. But the point is that you pour it over yourself on a hot day and then you shimmer all day.
Huh. Interesting. Okay. How old were you when you did that?
5.
Okay. You're like, it's just last week.
But then, well, actually, when I went to my son's children's business fair, because we entered him in the children's business fair, which he just nailed, because he cornered the market selling sandwiches from 11 to 1 where they had no other food
Oh,
available. Nailed it. So proud. But there was a girl there selling glitter water. I was like, it's still like this.
I would think that you'd be the only one that would even think of. So is that like an actual thing? That's so weird.
Right? But exactly. It's weird. It's different. It's crazy. It's quirky. It's something that creates interest. So, I mean, I have that I was Miss Congeniality on my bio. I
Mm.
have that I'm a 6-time WeGo health activist, that I've been featured in Forbes, and I have had a show on Netflix. Like, I give these pieces of interest that are like, oh, who it says, because when you spark curiosity in someone, that's when they're like, lean in. So, for example, I had one great guest on our Communication Queen podcast, Fern Chan, and she wrote this great book called How to Not Suck at Presentations. But I looked at her pitch and I reached back out to her. I said, because I just felt the intuitive nudge to just look her up. And I was like, oh my gosh, you've spoken for the UN. I wouldn't have known that from your pitch.
Mm.
And that's the thing, is like the humble brag, save that at the door. Demonstrate your mastery, own your accomplishments, and allow your pitch to be a way that you use your story as a testimony for possibility. I don't say do it with pride. I say do it as you are the example and the embodiment of something new and fun and different that's possible. You show possibility through the celebrations and the things that you've achieved in your life.
Mm. So now I'm curious about the Netflix thing.
So our movie Bro was on Netflix,
Okay.
and Spike and I were on a Netflix series called Being Dad on episodes 1, 3, and 8 that was all about our journey into parenthood.
Is that still on Netflix?
I think it is. They definitely
Huh.
reboot it every time Father's Day, so I think it'll be available in the upcoming month of June.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd probably just watch the episodes that you're on. Just like with Liz, like I never watched Survivor before
Same.
until this season. Yeah. Okay, so now we've talked about podcast pitching, and then now once you're actually on the podcast, what tips do you have or recommendations on how to make that the best experience for everybody?
So treat it like a first date. Like you're
Mm.
building a relationship with someone, like you're curious about them, you actually care, you're very curious about what they bring to the table, and you get to explore that together. And as the guest, also come in with an attitude of curiosity about who their audience is. What is the intention of the episode? Like I came in very clear that your audience, because we've talked about your audience, they're, people who are interested in budget conscious solutions to grow their business. They're not looking at dropping 20 grand on ad spend. They're in the frugalpreneur stages. And that's totally cool. And so I can guide the interview. I'm not going to talk about certain other things that I would talk about with some of my conscious leadership clients. When I go on a podcast that is typically has listenership of Fortune 500 or 1000 CEOs that are running a company with 50 employees, the tailoring of my message will be different to that audience compared to a message for more solopreneurs or startups who are getting started and growing and who are actively growing their businesses. Look at what is your message and how can you tailor it and how can you really honor that person's audience. So honor the podcaster's audience first and foremost. Then after the podcast interview, and I will totally ask you this question right after, always ask, aside from distributing the episode and sharing it on my socials, is there any other way that I can contribute to success? And I always like to frame this because sometimes people think, oh my gosh, is this a pitch? Are they looking? And I say, do you need an introduction? Is there something that particularly resonated? And then I always also ask, what did you love about this conversation? Because that'll give me an idea of also what the audience is going to pick up in real time. Because the podcast host is the greatest reflection, because like attracts like, of their audience. And so I will get to know, okay, this piece of my message really resonated with Sarah's audience. Great. And then how can I contribute to your success? Maybe it's a connection. Maybe it's another guest that I can introduce you to. Maybe it's a book recommendation. Maybe it's a podcast that I think you'd be a fit for. But whatever that is, follow up and build that relationship, because then you're building the relationship on a foundation of generosity. And it's not like the one night stand podcast where it's like, thanks for the interview. Okay. And the visibility, bye. Focus on what's that next step? What's the second date, the second business date that you can go on, or that act of generosity. So I take it when my husband started dating me, he cooked for me. That was his enticing thing of, let me invite you over for that date to come and let me do something for you that's generous, that demonstrates that I care, that shows that I am aware of things that you're struggling with. I've had podcasters say, oh my gosh, well, I'm really struggling with doing all the editing myself. And I'm like, great, let me introduce you to my editor. She's really affordable. If she's not a fit, maybe there's another podcast producer that I can introduce you to. And I give them some recommendations. Or maybe it's a book, maybe it's a connection. You don't know what it is, but then you will find that through building that relationship on a foundation of generosity, karma just returns in spades.
I love all that. I haven't heard someone really explain that before. So that's in terms of the guest and the connection maybe to the audience and host. But as far as trying to get any kind of potential clients or customers from that audience, I assume then that you should have a CTA or call to action of some sort. What are your tips for a good CTA?
So a great CTA is think of the medium. Podcasting is typically an auditory medium. So an auditory medium to an auditory medium. The CTAs that I don't see convert are get my free downloadable PDF, or worse, the ones that people use who are professional speakers. Text this number. And I'm like, people are driving when they're listening to podcasts. We don't need more people texting and driving. So think of the medium. So an easy one is auditory to auditory. And actually, I learned this from Dave Jackson, where he said, instead of saying, go listen to my podcast, Communication Queens or Crown Yourself on everywhere podcasts are, because that means that the person now needs to go in and they need to type in Crown Yourself and again, stop the texting and driving. So have it be really simple. So go to crownyourself.com/podcast, auditory medium to auditory medium. Because then what you do is podcast listeners, they listen to podcasts. So this is when having your own podcast is very valuable. But for those who don't, you can also have nameofyourbusiness.com/podcasts, because that's the page that you have all the other podcasts that you've been a guest on, where even if you don't have a podcast, people can come and still learn about your business, can still learn more about what you do. They can build a deeper relationship. And of course, on that page, because it's on your website, you have an email opt-in form where you capture their email, you capture their information. And that's probably the most valuable CTA ever, is you just bring them over to your website, but to the auditory medium on your website. So what guesting episodes, if you have a series of guesting episodes or a page for your podcast, that is one of the best. Or if you have an auditory course, that one works too. So it's not a podcast, but it's an auditory course. You can do that as well. I also had Cliff Ravenscraft on the Communication Queen podcast. He's amazing. And he recommended having entrepreneurs create a small 5 to 10 episode podcast, but that's their podcast project. So you don't have this ongoing interview series. You have a podcast that's a very specific, dedicated, high value podcast that you share all your best stuff in, everything of why you do what you do, what is important about you, what differentiates you from other coaches, consultants, agencies, service-based entrepreneurs, and how do you differentiate yourself from the industry, add so much value. And then that's a project. And then that podcast gets to live on an evergreen. So that's another option as well. If the idea of having this podcast that goes on into infinity is just too daunting, I agree. For many people, that's not the right time in their business. But if you can have one that you still host and say, hey, you can go over there and listen to that. It's some of my best content, my best information. Listen to this specific special 10 episode secret podcast. Just go to my website, mywebsite.com/podcast, and then you can subscribe and opt in, and then you get the podcast delivered to you as a secret podcast.
Okay. I love all of this. Okay. So I have a few comments. So I recently added my guest episodes to my website, and Spotify has a thing where you can create a playlist. So you could just Because how I was doing it was I would embed each and every episode. And first of all, that just takes up so much space and whatever. It might take it longer to
Yep.
load. I don't know. But if you just create one playlist, one HTML embed code or whatever, that just has all your episodes that you've been on and put that on your site, that's what I recommend for that. And then I love the audio to audio. I actually just have started thinking about that because my lead magnet has always been an ebook download. But the thing is, even if someone does download it, are they ever going to actually read it? And so I think the audio to audio format, or like maybe if you have an audio book or
Yeah,
something.
take your ebook and turn it into an audiobook, but think of the medium in which they're consuming. And this goes into what I do in my coaching, which is NLP coaching. And through NLP, you learn that there's 4 representational systems: visual, auditory, kinesthetic, which is tactile, and auditory digital, which means like you're in your head. And people consuming an auditory medium match the medium, you're going to match their representational system anyway. And so it automatically on a subconscious level creates even greater rapport.
The last thing I wanted to touch on or ask you about was being a TEDx speaker. You got to speak for TEDx, and I know you and I have talked about a little bit, but wanted you to share it with my listeners as far as what that process is like, what kind of tips that you have for becoming a TEDx speaker.
So my best tip is go on and be a guest on podcasts. And that's because I had 3 weeks to prepare my TEDx talk. Now, granted, it was 3 weeks that I had to actually prepare, which means write the full thing, prepare it, practice it, and have it stage ready in 3 weeks. And that's with having a newborn and another child and being stuck in a foreign country. So my TEDx experience is a little different than other people's. So when we were stuck in Australia, we were in Queensland, which I equate to the Florida of Australia during COVID times. So we were very open as long as you didn't leave the state. They weren't letting anybody in. So while we were stuck there, I was like, well, it's very open. So I wonder if there's any TED Talks going on. And I looked up a couple, and all you have to do is just go to TED, I think it's TED.com, and then you just search for ones that are in or near your area. And I submitted to a couple, and the one that got back to me, and I submitted to this one like I do to podcasts, which is relatable, build a relationship. And I found out that this TEDx producer was formerly a sculptor at Burning Man. Now, I've never been to Burning Man, but I'm from California, and it's like a big deal to go to Burning Man. I would love to go someday. It's just, I don't think I'll do it with 2 littles. So I just connected. I said, oh, I have a lot of friends who've gone to Burning Man, and they said it's an amazing experience. I found out on the day my son was born, because yes, I did open my laptop and open my email on the day my son was born after 16 hours later, and checked my email, found out that I was in the running. This was totally a divine moment too, because my TED Talk was very much about possibility, and the theme of the talk was on possibility. And prior to 2020, I had 3 TED Talk ideas, because the whole theme about TED is it's your one big idea. It's not your trauma story. It's not how much stuff you've gone through in your life, because there will always be someone who's had more trauma than you. And so it's not about your story. It's about what's that idea that moves people. And mine was always on that you're a testimony for possibility. You are that beacon of what is possible for others. And people are watching this testimony to see what can be possible for themselves. And I see this especially reflected as a mom. And so when I submitted, it was very much I would have to say it was very much a divine thing, because my father had just passed away in early 2021. And then the day my son was born, who is like the spitting image of my dad. And then I found out I met with the organizers on the day that would have been my parents' 52nd anniversary. And that's when I was approved. And that's when they were like, will you be ready in 3 weeks? And I was like, now or never. So it was very much, it felt very aligned. And I had just previously been in a mastermind where there was a speaker coach, and she had coached the CEO of Salesforce on his TED Talk. And so I sent her a message. I said, I'm going to hire you the second I find out. And she said, okay, I'm ready. And so I told her. And then when I found out, we got that booked, and we started prepping, and I basically took a lot of my writing from when my father was in the hospital and used that in my TED Talk. Like, that's a piece that comes into a few things. So I talk a lot. I was going on a lot of podcasts, so I knew which parts of my message really resonated with audiences. I also knew which parts of my story resonated because of the posts that I had posted, because the TEDx organizers, they said, we would really love if you could through line the story of you and your father and the challenges that I had growing up with my dad, who was an addict, but he was also a really successful entrepreneur. And so this like dichotomy of personality that I saw. And my whole talk was on, you get to decide who you want to be and what your story is of possibility. That big idea and the practicing of it, because I think I'd done 150 podcast episodes as a guest practicing. So I'd gotten proficient in my oratory skill set, and that it be learning how to tell your story, learning how to embed metaphors, learning how to practice sharing your story. These are skill sets that require practice. So I wouldn't have been able to do that had I not had the amount of practice and reps that I had put in, so that by the time I get the act, because I had a friend of mine who reached out and was working with a speaker coach. And she's like, you did your TED talk in 3 weeks. Why can't I? And I said, well, it's 3 weeks, but it's also about 25 years of theater experience and over 300 now podcast guesting episodes. So I'm very comfortable with seeing what resonates and what lands and speaking extemporaneously, and also understanding how to speak and be guided by a script. So there's a skill set that comes with it. And when you see someone doing something really expertly, then that's a sign that they've probably had a lot of practice. And so to get your TED talk, I'd say start practicing sharing your one big idea and start sharing, looking at what stories kind of demonstrate this one big idea. How can I share these stories in a great way? One of our clients, Kashif Khan, he is a TED talk. He did his TED talk in Canada, and he embeds some beautiful stories of his son and his niece. And based on his conversation of what he was sharing, I also saw him when I met him live. He shared those similar stories. So there was a practice and reps going in. And the reason why I say look at the stories is because our brains are hardwired for story. And even though TED is all about your one big idea, look at what are the stories that contribute to that one big idea, because then the one big idea will resonate subconsciously. It bypasses our cognitive dissonance faculty. Telling stories actually converts short-term memory into long-term memory, and it also sparks a little bit of dopamine in the brain. So the power of storytelling, look at how stories can support that one big idea, and then start sharing and practicing those stories on podcasts.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, thank you so much for your time today. It's been so good. So many good words of wisdom and nuggets and whatnot. Okay, so now it's time for your CTA. What is your CTA?
If you love this conversation and you would love to explore more about conscious leadership and high performance, then head on over to crownyourself.com/podcast and subscribe to our Crown Yourself podcast. And if you would love to learn more about how to leverage guest podcasting for your business, head on over to communicationqueens.com/podcast and subscribe to the Communication Queen podcast.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
I loved hanging out with you, Sarah. I always do.